Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that's pretty close to home for a lot of us, the future of Europe's economy.
And it's a fascinating time to be looking at this, right? I mean, you've got this global landscape shifting beneath our feet, new powerhouses emerging.
Exactly.
Mm.
And in the thick of it all is Europe, trying to carve out its own path. We've got this really in-depth report, The Future of European Competitiveness, and let me tell you, it is not shy about laying out the challenges.
It doesn't sugarcoat anything, that's for sure. It really digs into both strengths and weaknesses of the European economy, especially with the US and China as these like benchmark comparisons.
Right, because let's face it, those are the big players on the world stage right now. So where does that leave Europe? Well, one of the things that really jumped out at me early on in this report was this idea of an innovation deficit.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement, isn't it?
It is, but the report makes a pretty compelling case, and it's backed up by some, frankly, kind of startling statistics.
Well, and that's the thing about this report, right? It's not just throwing opinions around. There's data, there's analysis. For example, did you see that bit about how Europe hasn't produced a single tech company valued at over 100 billion in the last 50 years?
I did. And meanwhile, the U.S. has six that are valued over 1 trillion. I mean, that's a pretty stark contrast, wouldn't you say?
It definitely makes you stop and think, like, what's going on over there that we're missing?
Right. So clearly there are some challenges when it comes to innovation.
Yeah.
But before we go down that rabbit hole, I think it's important to acknowledge that Europe's got a lot going for it, too.
Absolutely. And the report doesn't shy away from that. It talks about the European model. I know it sounds a bit jargony, but it basically boils down to this: an open economy, a focus on market competition, but also a strong social safety net. It's this blend of like economic dynamism with social responsibility.
It's interesting, right? It's like they're trying to find that sweet spot between, letting businesses thrive, but also making sure that everyone benefits.
Exactly. And to a certain extent, they've been quite successful at it. You look at the level of economic integration within Europe, the fact that they have a single currency across much of the continent. I mean, that's a massive achievement.
It is. And they've managed to do that while maintaining relatively low levels of inequality, at least compared to some other parts of the world.
Right. It's not perfect, but they've definitely got something figured out in that regard. And we can't forget about their leadership in areas like sustainability and environmental standards. I mean, they're really setting the bar high for the rest of the world in those areas.
Absolutely. They're often seen as a bit of a pioneer when it comes to things like climate change and green technology. So it seems like they've got a solid foundation to build on, but then we come back to this innovation gap. If they're doing so well in other areas, why does this report suggest that they're falling behind?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. And the report points to a few key weaknesses, one of the biggest being this. While Europe excels at research, it struggles to turn those research breakthroughs into, well, actual products and services that people want to buy.
It's like having all the ingredients for an amazing meal, but forgetting to, actually cook it.
That's a great analogy. The report actually uses the term broken innovation life cycle.
Yeah.
They nail the early stages, the research, the development, but when it comes to scaling up, commercializing, competing on a global level, that's where they stumble.
So they've got all this potential, but they're not quite reaching it, at least not consistently. What's the missing link?
Well, the report digs into a few key challenges, and honestly, some of them are pretty daunting. One that immediately comes to mind, and I'm sure it's on everyone's radar these days, is energy.
Right, we've all seen the headlines about Europe's energy crisis,
Yeah.
especially with what's happening in Ukraine. How does that factor into the bigger picture here?
It's a major vulnerability, that's for sure. The report basically argues that Europe's dependence on natural gas imports, especially from Russia in the past, has left it in a really precarious position.
It's like they put all their eggs in one basket, and then that basket got, well, let's just say it got a little wobbly.
Exactly. And we saw the consequences, right? Energy prices went through the roof, businesses were struggling, people were feeling the pinch.
Yeah, not a pretty picture. So how do they get out of that bind? What's the solution?
Well, the report suggests a multi-pronged approach. One key aspect is leveraging their collective bargaining power as the EU, basically using their combined weight to secure long-term gas contracts at more stable prices.
Right, because there's strength in numbers. If they band together, they can negotiate from a stronger position.
Exactly. It's about playing the long game, not just reacting to the crisis of the moment. They also need to rethink their electricity market, make it more, I guess you could say, decarbonization friendly.
Because right now, it seems like the rules aren't really set up to favor renewables, even when they make economic sense.
Exactly. So they're trying to promote green energy, but the playing field isn't exactly level. And then there's the issue of bureaucracy, which, let's face it, is a bit of a recurring theme in Europe.
Yeah, red tape. The bane of progress, some might say. How does that rear its ugly head in this case?
Well, the report is pretty critical of the lengthy and often complex permitting processes for new energy projects, especially when it comes to renewables. They're trying to speed up the green transition, but these bureaucratic hurdles are slowing them down.
It's like trying to run a marathon with your shoelaces tied together.
Exactly. They need to streamline these processes, make it easier and faster to get these projects off the ground.
So less bureaucracy, more windmills and solar panels.
Got it.
Now, speaking of things that are essential for a modern economy, the report also highlights another area where Europe is facing some serious challenges: critical raw materials.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. We're talking about things like lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, the building blocks of, well, pretty much everything these days.
Smartphones, electric cars, solar panels, you name it. And if I'm not mistaken, Europe is pretty reliant on imports for most of these materials, right?
You're catching on. And that puts them in a very vulnerable position. The report actually calls it a global race to secure access to these materials. It's like a 21st century gold rush, except instead of gold, it's these essential minerals.
And I'm guessing they're not exactly leading the pack in this race.
Not by a long shot. The report argues that Europe needs to get much more strategic, much more proactive in securing its supply chains. They can't just sit back and hope for the best.
So what's the game plan? More mining, more exploration, more, dare I say, competition with other countries.
All of that is on the table, but it's more nuanced than just, digging up more stuff. They're talking about creating a European CRM board to streamline access to these materials, promoting domestic production and processing, even establishing strategic stockpiles.
Kind of like a national reserve, but for critical minerals.
Interesting.
It's about having a backup plan, right? Remember what happened during the pandemic when those global supply chains went haywire? They don't want to be caught flat-footed again.
Yeah, that was a wake-up call for a lot of people. Suddenly, we realized just how reliant we are on these complex global networks. Okay, so we've got the energy challenge, the critical raw materials challenge. What other hurdles does the report identify?
Well, this next one might sound a bit boring, but it's absolutely fundamental: investment. Right, because you can have all the great ideas in the world, but if you don't have the money to turn them into reality, well, you're not going to get very far.
Exactly. And the report basically argues that Europe needs to make itself a much more attractive destination for investors, both domestic and foreign.
So what's the problem? Why aren't investors banging down their doors?
Well, for starters, Europe's capital markets aren't as deep or as liquid as, say, the U.S. market. It's harder for companies, especially in the tech sector, to raise the capital they need to grow and compete on a global scale.
Yeah, it's like Silicon Valley has this gravitational pull on tech investment. Europe hasn't quite figured out how to replicate that.
Not yet, and that's something the report really emphasizes. They're calling for a true capital markets union within the EU, harmonizing regulations, making it easier to invest across borders, getting rid of all those little investment tax obstacles that trip people up.
It's about making Europe a more investor-friendly environment, right? Less fragmentation, more integration.
Precisely. And it's not just about attracting more investment. It's about making sure that investment is directed towards the sectors that are going to drive future growth.
Renewable energy, green technologies, digital innovation, all those things we've been talking about.
Exactly. It's about being smart with their money, not just throwing it at every shiny new thing that comes along. So to sum it up, Europe's facing some real challenges when it comes to energy, critical raw materials, and investment. But the report doesn't just leave us hanging there. They also offer some potential solutions, some ways forward.
Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom. There's a glimmer of hope.
There's always hope. And the report actually spends quite a bit of time looking at specific sectors of the European economy and how they can adapt and thrive in this changing landscape. Want to take a closer look at those?
Absolutely. Let's dive into the sector-specific stuff. I'm curious to see what they've got to say.
Well, the report dives into three main areas: automotive, defense, and space. Kind of an interesting mix right now.
It is. I guess it shows how interconnected these different sectors are becoming. But let's start with something that a lot of people can relate to: cars. Europe has a long and proud history of automotive manufacturing. But how are they navigating this whole shift towards electric vehicles and self-driving cars?
That's a great question, and it's one that the report spends a good deal of time on. And honestly, it's not the most optimistic picture. They're facing some serious headwinds in that sector.
Yeah, the competition is really heating up, isn't it? I mean, you've got Tesla, you've got the Chinese EV makers. Europe's traditional car companies are facing a whole new ballgame.
It's like they're trying to switch horses midstream, and the current's not exactly in their favor. The report talks about how they're grappling with higher production costs, which makes it harder to compete on price, and they're still playing catch up when it comes to some of the key technologies like battery technology and autonomous driving systems.
Mm. So it's a bit of a perfect storm in a way. They've got these legacy costs, they're facing fierce competition, and the technology is evolving at lightning speed. What's the solution? Can they turn things around?
Well, the report lays out a few key recommendations. One is to tackle those cost issues head on. They've got to find ways to streamline production, maybe rethink their labor costs, and just generally become more competitive on price.
Because at the end of the day, consumers care about their bottom line, right? If a European EV is significantly more expensive than a comparable model from China or the US, it's going to be a tough sell.
Exactly. They also need to double down on innovation, particularly in those areas where they're lagging behind, like battery technology. And let's not forget about infrastructure. You can build the best EV in the world, but if people don't have convenient places to charge it, it's not going to take off.
That's a really good point. It's about building that whole ecosystem, not just the cars themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, so automotive, definitely some challenges there, but also some potential paths forward. Now, what about defense? That's not something we typically think of as being directly tied to economic competitiveness, but the report makes a pretty strong case for why it matters.
It's not as intuitive as, say, the tech sector or manufacturing, but it's becoming increasingly clear that a strong defense industry is essential for a country's overall economic health. And Europe's, well, it's a bit fragmented.
Fragmented in what sense?
Well, you've got all these different countries with their own defense industries, often competing with each other instead of collaborating. They're not really leveraging the scale and the resources of the EU as a whole. And that puts them at a disadvantage, especially compared to the US, which has this massive integrated defense industrial base.
No, it's like they're trying to fight a modern war with a bunch of different armies that aren't really on the same page.
That's a pretty good analogy. And the report highlights another challenge, which is that Europe's R&D spending on defense is dwarfed by what the US invests. Like, it's not even close.
So they're being outspent, and they're not even working together effectively.
Yeah.
That's a recipe for trouble.
It is. And that's why the report calls for a more coordinated approach. They need to pool their resources, invest more in joint R&D projects, and really start thinking of themselves as a single block when it comes to defense.
Strength in numbers, right? It's a theme that keeps coming up. Okay, one more sector to cover.
Hi.
Space. I'll admit, when I first saw this in the report, I was a little bit surprised. I mean, I know satellites are important and all, but how does the space sector factor into this bigger conversation about Europe's global competitiveness?
It's a good question, and I think it speaks to how much the space sector has evolved in recent years. It's not just about, launching rockets and putting satellites into orbit anymore. It's about the data those satellites collect, the applications that data enables. We're talking telecommunications, navigation, Earth observation, even things like financial transactions rely on space-based infrastructure these days.
It's like it's become this invisible backbone of the global economy in a lot of ways.
Exactly. And the report argues that Europe needs to treat it as such. They've got a lot of strengths in the space sector. They've got Airbus, they've got the European Space Agency, but they're facing stiff competition, particularly from the US, which is investing heavily in both its public and private space programs.
So another area where they need to step up their game if they want to stay in the race.
Exactly. The report calls for some pretty significant reforms, like updating the governance structure of the European Space Agency, creating a more unified European space market, and establishing a dedicated fund to support critical technologies. It's about being more ambitious, more strategic, more forward-looking.
It seems like a common thread running through all of this is this need for a more coordinated, more unified approach. It's like they've got all these individual pieces, but they need to figure out how to fit them together into a more cohesive whole if they want to compete on a global scale.
That's a great point, and that actually brings us to the final and perhaps most important part of the report, the path forward. Because it's not just about identifying the challenges, it's about offering solutions, charting a course for the future.
So what's the roadmap? What are the key takeaways for our listeners who are thinking, okay, this is all very interesting, but what does it mean for me? What does it mean for the future?
The report boils it down to two fundamental pillars. governance, and skills. And by governance, they mean everything from how decisions are made within the EU to the regulatory environment for businesses. They argue that Europe needs to become much more agile, much more efficient, much less bogged down by bureaucracy if it wants to compete in the 21st century.
So less red tape, more action.
Exactly. And then there's the skills piece, which we've touched on a bit already. The report is very clear that Europe has a serious skills shortage, and it's holding them back in multiple sectors.
We're talking about digital skills,
Mm,
technical skills, management skills, all those things that are essential for a modern, innovative economy.
precisely. And the report stresses the need for a major overhaul of their education and training systems. They need to be more responsive to the needs of the job market, more focused on lifelong learning, more geared towards equipping people with the skills they need to thrive in this rapidly changing world.
So it's not just about, reforming this sector or that sector. It's about a fundamental shift in how they think about education, about workforce development, about the role of government in fostering innovation and competitiveness.
Exactly. And that's what makes this report so fascinating. It takes this really comprehensive, holistic view. It's not just about quick fixes or band-aid solutions. It's about tackling these deep-seated challenges head on and really thinking long term.
It's about asking those tough questions like, what kind of Europe do we want to be in the 21st century? And what do we need to do today to make that vision a reality?
Well said. And I think that's a great note to end on. It's a call to action, not just for policymakers, but for all of us. Because the future of Europe, the future of the global economy, it's not something that's going to be decided in some far-off boardroom. It's something we're all shaping every day through the choices we make, the investments we make, the skills we develop.
So, to our listeners out there, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you from this conversation? What are you seeing in your own work, in your own industries? Join the conversation online, and let's keep this dialogue going.
Absolutely, because these are big, complex issues, and we need all the brain power we can get.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap things up for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.